There's a thought that used to cross my mind more often than I'd like to admit, but I never really stopped to question it. What if I'm doing everything right, and it's still not enough? It's a quiet kind of doubt, the kind that doesn't show up all at once, but builds slowly over time. You brush your teeth, you follow the routine, you do what you've always been told, and yet, every now and then, something feels off. A little bleeding when you spit, a slight sensitivity that wasn't there before, that persistent feeling that your mouth isn't as healthy as it should be. And the strange part is, you can't quite explain why, because on the surface you're doing what you're supposed to do. For a long time, I assumed that was just how it was, that maybe some people are just more prone to gum issues, that maybe it's genetics, or bad luck, or something out of my control. But that explanation never felt complete, because if that were true, why do these problems often follow the same pattern? Why do they start small, almost unnoticeable, and then gradually become harder to ignore? That's when a different question started to take shape. What if it's not about doing more, but about understanding what's missing? And not because someone is hiding it from you on purpose, but because certain details just aren't explained clearly in everyday advice. And those details? They matter more than most people realize, because gum problems don't appear randomly. They're usually the result of a process that's been developing quietly, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. It starts with plaque, a thin, sticky film of bacteria that forms on your teeth constantly. That part is normal. It happens to everyone. But what matters is what happens next. If that plaque isn't effectively disrupted on a daily basis, it begins to accumulate along the gum line. The body reacts to it, the gums become inflamed, and that's when the early signs start to show. Bleeding, redness, swelling. At this stage, it's often referred to as gingivitis. And here's something that isn't emphasized enough. At this point, the condition is still reversible, but only if the right actions are taken consistently. If not, it can progress into something more serious, periodontitis, where the structures supporting your teeth begin to break down. And that's when things become much harder to manage. What makes this tricky is that most people aren't ignoring their health. They're just missing key pieces of the puzzle. For example, brushing alone is not enough. That might sound obvious, but think about how many times flossing is treated as optional. Something you do when you remember. Something secondary. But plaque doesn't just sit on the surface of your teeth. It hides between them, along the edges, in areas your toothbrush physically cannot reach. And if those areas are neglected, even a perfect brushing routine leaves gaps. Another detail that often goes unnoticed is how brushing is done. It's not about pressure. In fact, brushing too hard can actually damage your gums over time, making them more vulnerable instead of healthier. The technique matters. Small, gentle movements, angling the brush toward the gum line, spending enough time in each area. These are the kinds of things that rarely get explained in a way that sticks, but they change everything when applied correctly. We've left a practical guide in the first link in the description for quick access. Click and see. Because once you start to see these gaps, you realize something important. It's not that you were doing nothing. It's that you were never shown the full picture. And that realization can be uncomfortable at first, because it forces you to rethink what you assumed was enough. But at the same time, it's also empowering. Because now, you're no longer guessing, you're adjusting with intention. As I kept looking deeper, another layer became clear. Something that most people rarely connect to gum health. Daily habits outside the bathroom. Diet, for example. Frequent sugar intake feeds the bacteria responsible for plaque buildup. It's not just about how much sugar you consume, but how often. Constant snacking keeps your mouth in a more acidic state. Giving bacteria more opportunities to thrive. Hydration plays a role too. Saliva is one of your body's natural defenses. It helps neutralize acids and wash away debris. When you're dehydrated, that protective effect decreases, and plaque gets a better chance to build up. Even stress can influence this process. It affects your immune response, which can make your gums more susceptible to inflammation. None of these factors act alone. They work together, quietly shaping the environment in your mouth every single day. And when you don't see the connection, it feels like the problem is random. But it's not. There's a pattern. And once you understand that pattern, you start to see opportunities where you didn't before. Small adjustments, simple changes, things that don't require extreme effort. but create real impact over time. That's when the shift happens. The bleeding becomes less frequent. The sensitivity starts to fade. The overall feeling of your mouth begins to change. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. And with that, something else changes too. That quiet doubt you used to feel? It starts to disappear. Because now you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. But here's where it gets interesting, and where most conversations about gum health stop short. Because there's another dimension to this that almost never gets addressed directly in the standard advice you hear. It has to do with timing, not just how often you brush or floss, but when you do it in relation to other activities in your day. Think about it. Most people brush their teeth in the morning, right after waking up, before breakfast, which seems logical at first glance. You want fresh breath, you want to feel clean. But here's what rarely gets mentioned. Overnight, bacteria multiply in your mouth. That's why you wake up with that coating on your tongue, that stale taste. Your saliva production decreases while you sleep, so your natural defenses are lower. Brushing first thing removes some of that buildup. But then you eat breakfast. And depending on what you eat, acidic foods, sugary cereals, orange juice, you're reintroducing acids and sugars that bacteria feed on. So the question becomes, is brushing before breakfast enough? Or would brushing after breakfast be more effective? The answer isn't as straightforward as you might think, because if you brush immediately after consuming something acidic, you might actually be doing more harm than good. Acids soften your enamel temporarily. Brushing while your enamel is in that softened state can wear it down faster. So the ideal timing is more nuanced. Brush before breakfast to remove overnight buildup, but rinse with water after eating. Wait about 30 minutes if you consumed anything acidic before brushing again. That level of detail, it's almost never part of the conversation, and yet it shapes outcomes in a real way. Because consistency isn't just about doing the same thing every day, it's about doing the right thing, in the right sequence, under the right conditions. Another layer that gets overlooked is the tool itself. The toothbrush. People tend to think of it as a static object. You buy one, you use it, eventually you replace it. But not all toothbrushes are created equal. And more importantly, the condition of your toothbrush changes how effective it is. Frayed bristles don't clean as well. They can't reach into the small spaces along your gum line. They lose their ability to disrupt plaque effectively. But here's what surprised me when I started paying attention. Most people wait way too long to replace their toothbrush. The general recommendation is every 3 to 4 months. But if you're brushing properly, with enough frequency and correct technique, the bristles often wear out sooner. And if you've been sick, the bacteria can linger on the brush longer than you'd expect. So that optional replacement schedule? It's not optional if you want optimal results. The same applies to floss. People assume all floss works the same way, but there's waxed and unwaxed. There's tape style and traditional string. There's even water flossers, which work on an entirely different mechanism. Each has advantages depending on your specific situation. Tight spaces between teeth, waxed floss slides easier. Wider gaps or braces, a water flosser might be more effective. Sensitive gums that bleed easily? You need something gentle enough not to cause trauma, but effective enough to actually remove buildup. These aren't minor details. They're the difference between going through the motions and actually achieving the outcome you're aiming for. And this brings up something even deeper. Something that connects to how we think about prevention in general. Because if you look closely at how most health advice is structured, it's reactive. Wait until there's a problem, then address it. Bleeding gums? Use a special toothpaste. Sensitivity? Try a desensitizing formula. Bad breath? Reach for mouthwash. None of those solutions are wrong, but they're treating symptoms. They're not addressing the root cause. And the root cause, in most cases, is the same thing we've been circling around this entire time. Plaque accumulation and the inflammatory response it triggers. Everything else is downstream from that. So the real shift happens when you stop thinking about oral care as damage control and start thinking about it as environment management. You're not just cleaning your teeth. You're creating conditions where harmful bacteria struggle to thrive. You're supporting your body's natural defenses instead of working against them. You're building resilience, not just responding to breakdowns. That reframing changes everything. Because suddenly, it's not about adding more products to your routine. It's about optimizing the routine you already have. Let me give you an example of what that looks like in practice. Let's say you've been experiencing occasional gum bleeding. The reactive approach says, Switch to a toothpaste marketed for gum health. The preventive approach asks, where is the bleeding happening and why? Is it in one specific area? That might indicate a spot you're consistently missing when you brush. Is it happening when you floss? That could mean you're being too aggressive or not flossing regularly enough, so the gums are inflamed from buildup. Is it generalized across your mouth? That suggests a systemic issue, either technique, frequency, or an outside factor like stress or diet. Once you identify the actual cause, the solution becomes clear. And it's usually simpler than you expected. Maybe you need to adjust your brushing angle in one area. Maybe you need to floss more gently but more consistently. Maybe you need to increase your water intake or reduce how often you're snacking throughout the day. Small changes, targeted adjustments, but they work because they're addressing the real issue instead of masking it. We've left a practical guide in the first link in the description for quick access. Click and see. Now here's where it gets even more specific. And this is something I wish someone had explained to me years ago. There's a difference between plaque and tartar, and understanding that difference is critical. Plaque is soft. It's that sticky film you can feel on your teeth if you run your tongue across them before brushing. It's made up of bacteria, food particles, and saliva. And here's the key part. Plaque can be removed with proper brushing and flossing. But if plaque is left undisturbed for too long, it hardens, it calcifies. And once that happens, it becomes tartar, also called calculus. And here's the thing about tartar. You can't remove it at home, no matter how well you brush, no matter what toothpaste you use. Once plaque has hardened into tartar, it requires professional cleaning to remove. That's what your dentist or hygienist does during a routine cleaning. They use specialized tools to scrape away the buildup that's bonded to your teeth. And this is where a lot of people get stuck in a cycle they don't realize they're in. They brush and floss, but not thoroughly enough or consistently enough. Plaque accumulates in the spots they miss. It hardens into tartar. They go to the dentist every 6 months. The tartar gets removed. They feel clean for a while, but the cycle repeats. Because the underlying habits never changed. The tartar keeps coming back, and each time it does, it brings inflammation with it. Over time, that inflammation doesn't just affect your gums. It affects the bone supporting your teeth. That's when periodontitis sets in, and once you've lost bone, you can't get it back. You can stop the progression. You can manage it. But the damage is permanent. So the window for prevention is earlier than most people realize. It's not when your gums start bleeding regularly. It's not when you notice your teeth shifting slightly. It's before any of that becomes noticeable. It's in the daily decisions that seem too small to matter. But they add up, and they determine whether you're moving toward stability or toward breakdown. Here's another element that rarely gets talked about. The psychological side of this. Because oral care isn't just a physical practice, it's also a mental one. And the way you think about it shapes whether you actually follow through. For example, if you see brushing and flossing as a chore, something you have to do, it becomes easy to cut corners, to rush through it, to skip it when you're tired. But if you see it as something you're doing for yourself, as an investment in avoiding future pain, future costs, future complications, the motivation changes. It's no longer about obligation, it's about self-respect. And that shift, from I have to I choose to, makes consistency easier. Because you're not forcing yourself to do something you resent. You're choosing to take care of something that matters to you. Your comfort, your confidence, your long-term health. That's a completely different relationship with the same actions. And it shows up in how thoroughly you do them, how consistently you maintain them, how willing you are to adjust when something isn't working. But there's another psychological trap that's just as common. And it's more subtle. It's the belief that because you haven't had major problems yet, you won't. That your gums are fine. That your routine is working. That you're one of the lucky ones. And maybe you are. But the tricky thing about gum disease is that it's often painless in the early stages. You don't feel it progressing. You don't notice the slow recession of your gum line. You don't realize the pockets deepening between your gums and teeth. Until one day, you do. And by then, reversing it is much harder. So the absence of symptoms isn't the same as the absence of risk. And assuming everything is fine just because nothing hurts can be a costly mistake. This is why regular dental checkups matter, not just for cleanings, but for measuring things you can't see or feel on your own. Pocket depth, gum attachment, early signs of bone loss. These are things a professional can catch before they become problems you notice. And catching them early. That's the difference between a simple intervention and a complicated one. But let's come back to something you can control right now, because professional care is important. But it's only part of the equation. The daily habits are where the real work happens, and one of the most underrated aspects of those habits is intentionality. Most people brush on autopilot, same motion, same speed, same areas. They've done it the same way for so long they don't even think about it anymore. But autopilot means you're also repeating the same mistakes, missing the same spots, applying the same incorrect pressure, reinforcing the same gaps in your technique. So what changes that? Attention, slowing down enough to actually feel what you're doing, noticing where the bristles are making contact, noticing where they're not, adjusting your angle when you hit a difficult area instead of just moving past it, spending a few extra seconds in the spots that tend to accumulate more buildup. That kind of mindful engagement doesn't take much longer, but it makes a measurable difference, because you're not just going through the motions anymore. You're actively disrupting plaque in all the places it tries to hide. And here's something else worth considering. Your mouth changes over time. The spacing of your teeth might shift slightly. Your gums might recede in certain areas, exposing more surface to clean. You might develop sensitivity in spots that were never sensitive before. What worked perfectly 5 years ago might not be enough now, so your routine needs to evolve with you. That doesn't mean overhauling everything. It means staying aware, noticing when something feels different, adjusting accordingly, and not assuming that what's always worked will always continue to work without modification. Let's talk about another factor that doesn't get nearly enough attention: inflammation. We've mentioned it in the context of gum disease. But inflammation is a much bigger concept than most people realize. It's your body's immune response to something it perceives as a threat. In the case of gum disease, that threat is bacterial plaque. Your immune system sends white blood cells to the area. Blood flow increases. The tissue swells. That's inflammation. And in the short term, it's protective. But when inflammation becomes chronic, when it's constantly triggered because the irritant is never fully removed, it starts causing damage. The gums pull away from the teeth. The bone underneath begins to break down. The structures holding your teeth in place weaken. And here's the connection that most people miss. Chronic inflammation in your gums doesn't stay isolated to your mouth. Research has shown links between periodontal disease and other inflammatory conditions: heart disease, diabetes, respiratory infections, even pregnancy complications. The bacteria from your mouth can enter your bloodstream. The inflammatory markers can circulate throughout your body. So taking care of your gums isn't just about your teeth. It's about reducing systemic inflammation. It's about lowering your overall disease risk. That's a much bigger picture than most people consider when they think about brushing and flossing. But it's real. And it's documented in medical literature, which means the stakes are higher than just aesthetics or comfort. They're about your overall health trajectory. Now let's address something practical. Because all of this information is only useful if you can actually apply it. And one of the biggest barriers to application is overwhelm. When you're suddenly aware of everything that could be going wrong, it's easy to feel paralyzed, like there's too much to fix, too much to change. But that's not the right way to approach this. You don't need to overhaul your entire life overnight. You just need to start with one thing, one adjustment, one improvement, and let that become consistent before adding the next. Maybe it's committing to flossing every single night for 2 weeks. Maybe it's switching to a softer toothbrush and focusing on gentler pressure. Maybe it's setting a timer for 2 full minutes when you brush instead of rushing through it. Pick one, make it non-negotiable, and once it's integrated into your routine so deeply that it feels automatic, add the next thing. That's how sustainable change happens, not through willpower, through structure, through making the right choice the easy choice. And here's something that helps with that. Tracking. Not in an obsessive way, but in a way that creates accountability. Mark an X on a calendar every day you floss. Watch the chain of X's grow. Your brain will want to keep the streak going, or use a habit tracking app if that's more your style. The point is to make your consistency visible, because when you can see your progress, you're more likely to maintain it. And when you do slip up, because you will, everyone does, you can see it as a single break in the pattern instead of a total failure. You just get back on track the next day. No guilt, no shame, just continuation. Let's talk about mouthwash for a moment, because it's one of those products that's everywhere, but often misunderstood. A lot of people use mouthwash as a shortcut, a way to feel clean without putting in the full effort of brushing and flossing. But here's the reality. Mouthwash doesn't remove plaque. It can kill bacteria temporarily. It can freshen your breath. It can deliver fluoride or other active ingredients to your teeth. But it's not a substitute for mechanical cleaning. The physical act of brushing and flossing is what disrupts and removes plaque. Mouthwash is supplemental. It can enhance your routine, but it can't replace the core components. That said, there are times when mouthwash is genuinely helpful. If you have dry mouth, certain formulas can help maintain moisture. If you're dealing with active gum inflammation, an antimicrobial rinse prescribed by your dentist can support healing. If you're at high risk for cavities, a fluoride rinse adds extra protection. But for most people, most of the time, focus on brushing and flossing correctly. Everything else is secondary. Now let's address one more thing that almost never comes up in these discussions: the role of genetics. Because while habits matter enormously, they're not the only factor. Some people are genetically predisposed to gum disease. Their immune response to bacterial plaque is more aggressive. Their gums are more prone to recession. Their bone structure is less resilient. If you have a family history of gum problems, you're at higher risk, and that means you need to be even more diligent with your routine. It's not fair, but it's reality. The good news is that even with a genetic predisposition, you're not helpless. You just have a narrower margin for error. Where someone else might get away with inconsistent flossing, you can't. Where someone else might brush quickly and still maintain healthy gums, you need to be more thorough. But if you know that going in, you can adjust accordingly. You can work with your dentist to monitor more closely. You can be more aggressive with prevention, and you can still maintain healthy gums for decades. It just requires a higher level of commitment. Here's something else that's worth understanding: the connection between oral health and aging. As you get older, your gums naturally recede to some degree. Your saliva production decreases. Your enamel thins. These are normal parts of aging, but they also mean that the strategies that worked when you were younger might not be sufficient now. You might need to be more proactive about hydration. You might need to use toothpaste designed for sensitive teeth as more of your root surface becomes exposed. You might need more frequent dental cleanings to stay ahead of tartar buildup. Aging doesn't mean you're destined for gum disease, but it does mean your routine needs to evolve. And the earlier you make those adjustments, the better your outcomes will be. Because here's the thing about gum health: it's cumulative. The care you give your gums in your 20s and 30s affects what they look like in your 50s and 60s. The habits you build now determine how many of your natural teeth you'll still have decades from now. It's not dramatic, it's not immediate, but it's real, and it's within your control. So when you think about brushing and flossing, don't think about today. Think about 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Think about the version of yourself who will either be grateful you took this seriously, or frustrated that you didn't. Because that future version of you is shaped by the choices you make right now. We've left a practical guide in the first link in the description for quick access. Click and see. Let's get into some specifics about technique. Because knowing what to do is one thing, knowing how to do it well is another. When you brush, the angle of your toothbrush matters more than most people realize. You want the bristles at a 45-degree angle to your gum line, not straight on, not parallel. 45 degrees. That allows the bristles to get slightly under the gum line where plaque likes to hide. You're not scrubbing. You're gently sweeping. Short back and forth motions, or small circular motions. Either works, as long as you're covering every surface. Outer surfaces, inner surfaces, chewing surfaces. And don't forget the backs of your molars. That's one of the most commonly missed areas. Each quadrant of your mouth should get at least 30 seconds. That's why the standard recommendation is 2 minutes total. It sounds simple, but if you actually time yourself, you might be surprised at how much shorter your usual routine really is. Now flossing. This is where technique makes the biggest difference. You're not just shoving the floss between your teeth and yanking it back out. You're wrapping the floss in a C shape around each tooth, sliding it gently below the gum line, moving it up and down against the side of the tooth to scrape off plaque. Then doing the same thing on the adjacent tooth before moving to the next space. That means each gap between teeth gets flossed twice. Once on each side. Most people skip that step. They go straight down and straight back up. But that misses half the surface area where plaque accumulates. And if you're not removing plaque from those surfaces, it's going to calcify, it's going to turn into tartar, and you'll be back to square one. Here's another detail. Bleeding when you floss doesn't necessarily mean you're flossing wrong. In fact, if you haven't been flossing regularly, bleeding is expected. Your gums are inflamed from plaque buildup. When you disrupt that plaque, the inflamed tissue bleeds easily, but if you keep flossing consistently, the inflammation will decrease, and the bleeding will stop, usually within a week or two. If it doesn't stop after consistent flossing for 2 weeks, that's a sign you need to see a dentist. There might be tartar buildup that needs professional removal, or there might be a deeper pocket that needs treatment. But occasional bleeding when you first start flossing again after a gap? That's normal. Don't let it scare you into stopping. That's actually when you need to keep going. Let me share something I learned the hard way. There's a difference between pain and discomfort. Discomfort when flossing, especially if you haven't done it in a while, is normal. Your gums are tender, they're adjusting. But sharp pain, that's different. If flossing causes sharp, stabbing pain in a specific area, that's a signal. It could be a cavity between teeth. It could be a rough edge on a filling that's catching the floss. It could be a gum pocket that's infected. Don't ignore it. That's your body telling you something needs attention. And the sooner you address it, the simpler the fix will be. Now let's talk about what happens if you've already developed gum disease. Because this isn't just a prevention conversation. Some of you reading this might already know you have problems. You've been told you have gingivitis, or maybe even periodontitis. And you're wondering, is it too late? The answer is no, it's not too late. But the approach changes. Once you have periodontitis, you can't reverse the bone loss, but you can stop the progression, you can stabilize the condition, and you can prevent it from getting worse. That usually requires more intensive treatment. Scaling and root planing, a deep cleaning that goes below the gum line to remove tartar from the root surfaces. Sometimes antibiotics to reduce bacterial load. Sometimes more frequent cleanings, every 3 months instead of every 6. And it definitely requires a more rigorous daily routine at home, because professional treatment can reset things. But if your daily habits don't change, the disease will come back. That's the part that's hard to hear. But it's also the part that gives you control. You're not helpless. You're not at the mercy of your condition. You just have to be willing to do what's necessary, consistently, for the long term. And if you do, you can keep your teeth. You can avoid the more severe complications. You can maintain quality of life. But it requires commitment. Let's talk about cost for a moment, because that's a real barrier for a lot of people. Dental care is expensive, especially if you don't have insurance. And even if you do, coverage is often limited. So the idea of regular cleanings, potential treatments, specialized products, it can feel overwhelming. But here's the calculation that's worth making. Prevention is always cheaper than treatment. A toothbrush and floss cost a few dollars. A routine cleaning might cost $100 or so out of pocket. Compare that to the cost of treating periodontitis. Scaling and root planing can run into the hundreds or thousands. Gum surgery? Even more. Tooth extraction and replacement? Thousands per tooth. Implants? Tens of thousands. So when you look at it over time, the cost of prevention is a fraction of the cost of intervention, and that's just the financial cost. There's also the cost in pain, in time, in stress, in diminished quality of life. Those are harder to quantify, but they're real, and they're avoidable. So if budget is a concern, prioritize the basics. A good toothbrush doesn't have to be expensive. Manual brushes work just fine if you use them correctly. Floss is cheap, water is free. Focus on technique and consistency. Those will give you more return on investment than any expensive product ever could. Here's one more layer to consider. The social and emotional impact of gum problems. Because this isn't just about health, it's about confidence. Bad breath from gum disease affects how you interact with people, whether you feel comfortable speaking up in meetings, whether you avoid close conversations, whether you smile freely or keep your mouth closed. Receding gums and tooth loss affect how you see yourself, how you feel about your appearance, whether you avoid photos, whether you feel self-conscious in social situations. These aren't trivial concerns. They affect your relationships, your career, your mental health, and they're often the result of issues that could have been prevented, or at least minimized. So when you think about why this matters, don't just think about your teeth. Think about everything connected to them. Your confidence, your comfort, your ability to live without constant worry about your oral health. That's what's really at stake. And that's why these small daily habits matter so much, because they're not just about avoiding problems. They're about preserving the things that make life enjoyable. The ability to eat what you want without pain. the freedom to smile without self-consciousness, the peace of mind that comes from knowing you're taking care of yourself. Those are the real outcomes, and they're worth protecting. So here's what it comes down to. You have more control over your gum health than you probably realized. Not absolute control. Genetics, aging, and other factors play a role. But within the space you can control, the impact is significant. And it starts with understanding that gum disease isn't random. It's predictable. It follows a pattern. And when you understand that pattern, you can interrupt it. You can prevent it. You can manage it. Not through complicated interventions, not through expensive products, but through consistent, informed daily habits. Brushing correctly, flossing thoroughly, paying attention to timing and technique, supporting your efforts with good hydration and smart dietary choices, and catching problems early through regular professional care. That's the framework. It's simple. But simple doesn't mean easy, because the challenge isn't knowing what to do. It's doing it, day after day, even when you're tired, even when it seems like nothing is happening, even when the benefits feel invisible. That's where discipline comes in. And discipline isn't about forcing yourself to do things you hate. It's about building systems that make the right choices automatic. It's about making your environment work for you instead of against you. It's about connecting your daily actions to the outcomes you actually care about. So if you've made it this far in the conversation, you're already ahead of most people, because you're willing to look at the details, to question your assumptions, to consider whether what you've been doing is actually enough. And that openness, that willingness to adjust, that's what makes the difference. Not perfection, not overnight transformation, just the steady accumulation of small improvements over time. Because your gums don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be consistent and intentional and willing to course correct when something isn't working. That's all it takes. And the results? They might not be dramatic at first, but over months and years, they compound. Less bleeding, less sensitivity, less worry, more confidence, more comfort, more years with your natural teeth intact. That's the trade-off. A few minutes a day for decades of better outcomes. It's one of the best investments you can make. And it's never too late to start. Whether you're 20 or 60, whether your gums are healthy or already showing signs of disease, you can always improve from where you are right now. You just have to decide that it matters. And then act like it does. We've left a practical guide in the first link in the description for quick access. Click and see. Because clarity replaces uncertainty, and that changes how you approach everything. You stop reacting to symptoms and start preventing them. You stop wondering if something is wrong and start recognizing the signals early. And maybe that's the part that isn't said often enough, not because it's a secret, but because it's simple. And simple things are easy to overlook. But those simple details, they're often the difference between a problem that progresses and one that stops in its tracks. So if you've ever had that feeling that maybe you're missing something, even while doing your best, you're not alone. But now you know this. It's not about doing more. It's about understanding better. And once you do, you give yourself the chance to protect your gums before the problem becomes something harder to reverse. If this made you see things from a different perspective, subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning. And the more you understand these small, often ignored details, the more control you gain over your health, your confidence, and your peace of mind moving forward.